Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Populism and nativism have certainly come to America. The Brexit vote was a kind of canary in the coal mine for the U.S. and for the world. And now that wave of populism and extreme nationalism seems to be spreading throughout the rest of Europe. Marine Le Pen continues to make inroads in France, and in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders could take control of one of Europe's most liberal democracies. To get a better view of what's happening in Europe, and in the Netherlands specifically, I'm joined by Simon Cooper of the Financial Times. Simon, welcome to Radio Who, What, Why.
Hi, how are you?
First of all, tell us a little bit about who Geert Wilders is.
Well, Geert Wilders he calls himself the Dutch Trump, but he has been a nativist politician since 11 years now. He leads a party that's way more anti-Islam than Trump is. He proposes closing mosques in the Netherlands, banning the Quran, shutting borders, and leaving the European Union. So he really appeals to white Dutch people who feel that, they've lost their country. Some of that will be familiar to Americans. But, he's like Trump, he's a great Twitter performer. He's very articulate. He's immediately recognizable because, like Trump, he has this long blonde hair, although in his case I think it's real, although dyed. And, he's very kind of entertaining when you see him on TV. I met him in person last year, and I have to say in person, he's witty, he's intelligent, he's good company.
One of the things that has been written about him is how smart he is, how effective he is as a politician.
Yeah, he knows how to put his finger on the sore spot, as the Dutch say. He continued. There was Holland had one of the first nativist leaders in 2001 too. It was Pim Fortuyn, who just when September 11th happened, came up and started attacking Islam, called it a backward religion, got very popular, and then was assassinated by a green activist within months of his rise. And Wilders has really taken over that role. And he found that, there was a lot of hidden Dutch discontent about immigration, about Islam, about the supposed distant elites, that kind of thing. And he has ridden that in a very articulate way. He has total control of his party. He is the only member of his party. You can vote for the party, but you cannot join it. And so he has complete control over everything that happens. But I would say this guy is not going to be prime minister because, in the US, you pretty much have a two-party system. In Holland, there's about 15 parties now. The government is always a coalition. You need more than 50%, of the votes to form a successful coalition. Wilders is going to get, say, 15 to 20%, and nobody wants to rule with him. So he, I think, is going to remain a kind of a critic, somebody who says this whole thing doesn't work, you're all doing the wrong thing, and is not going to be prime minister. And I'm not even sure he wants to be prime minister. I'm not sure that's his goal. Mm-hmm.
Given that he is only going to get 20% of the vote, roughly, to what extent does that view represent a really strong influence in Dutch politics?
It's definitely an influence. It's forced the established parties to tack to the right on issues like immigration, integration, Islam. But, if you add up, most of the Dutch parties are pretty small. They're splintered. So if you add up the centre-right parties, they're bigger than Wilders. If you add up the left-wing parties, they're bigger than Wilders. You could make a green coalition that's bigger than Wilders. So, people say he's going to win the Dutch elections. Foreigners say that. But that's only because, yes, he might become the biggest party. He might not, but he might. But becoming the biggest party is not that important. It's about having a coalition. And he'd be the biggest party only because he's the only really serious nativist party. There's nobody else on that flank. He has it to himself. So, he influences the debate. He pushes the other parties to the right on these let's say, race issues. But that's his main role. But you see, I also think he wants to speak more to Americans and to some degree to Israelis and to be a player in global politics. He went to the Republican convention in Cleveland. What's important, Holland is a small country. Being the Dutch prime minister is not a very powerful job because you're representing a coalition, so your own views are not very significant. It's more like, leading a group of people who disagree. You don't have that much power, but what he wants is to be heard by people like Benjamin Netanyahu, to be heard by American neocons like David Horowitz, to get funding from them, to give speeches that are heard around the world. And so in a way, he's more an international politician than he is a Dutch politician.
How much of what he's appealing to is as a result of the waves of immigration and refugees that have come into the country, and how much represents a kind of economic nationalism for the Netherlands?
I mean, the Netherlands is now, when I grew up in Holland in the 70s and 80s, it was very white. There were small groups of Turks, Moroccans, people from the Dutch Caribbean, but there weren't many and they weren't that visible. And now more than 10% of the population is non-white immigrants, more or less. And so, suddenly the bigger cities, Rotterdam and Amsterdam, have a very different look than they did when I was a child. And you see mosques, for example. You see all sorts of ethnic shops. And for some people, that's been a shock. So, yes, he has ridden that. And then, of course, the fear of terrorism, which came up after 9/11, that has been an important part of his appeal. And then there's, what you don't have in America is the idea the European Union is taking decisions for us and is, usurping our national rights. That's a big thing for all the European populists. But on economic nationalism, you see, in the U.S. you have Trump saying, let's be protectionist. And that's a reasonable strategy. Well, it's not a completely insane strategy for the U.S. because you have a very large domestic market. But the Netherlands has always traded with foreign countries. It's a very open economy. I mean, a big part of the Dutch economy is just sending goods into and out of Germany, which is the world's biggest manufacturing exporter. So, a lot of Holland is just tailed to having trains come in from Germany with stuff. We put it on a boat in the harbor and send it to China. And so the idea of closing off the Netherlands, having a kind of protectionist Trump agenda, just nobody wants that. That wouldn't fly. That's not what he's proposing either. And the other big difference with the U.S. Republicans is that he's quite left-wing on economics and social protection because his voters tend to be poorer whites and they want a strong state. They want high unemployment benefits. They want, good health care from the state. So he's in favor of protecting all that. He's not really much of a free marketeer when it comes to these kinds of social issues. So he's this weird combination of socioeconomically quite left-wing and then on identity politics, very right-wing.
Mm-hmm. And where does he stand with respect to the European Union?
He hates it. He wants to leave. I mean, he favors an exit, as it's known, but there's very little constituency for that. In Britain, you do have this idea we're a big country, so we can cope without the EU. But the Netherlands is one of the founding members of the EU. As I say, a small country, totally dependent on international trade. If the Netherlands leaves the EU, nobody is going to hear the Dutch voice in the world. Whereas through the EU, the Netherlands has some influence. It has a seat at, the table of the biggest economic power. So he is not. It's not going to happen that the Netherlands is going to leave the EU unless the EU completely collapses as a result of France pulling out in the wake of a Marine Le Pen presidency after Britain. But the Netherlands will be one of the last countries still on the ship.
There was a story last week about the potential influence of American money, American dollars coming into this election. Is that really significant? And is there any attempt at Russian influence in this election?
Yeah, I mean, Wilders has always raised a lot of money in the U.S. from neocons, from people who think that Europe's about to become an Islamic caliphate. And he plays up to that fear, and he says, I'm here to protect Europe. I mean, when I interviewed him, he sat in his office under a portrait of Churchill, so he pretends to be the European Churchill, saving Europe from the new kind of fascism. So, yeah, I mean, he gets these donations. He has to fight a lot of legal cases because he's constantly breaking Article 1 of the Constitution, which forbids discrimination. He says nasty things about ethnic groups. So he has a lot of legal cases to fight, and he spends money on that, American money. It doesn't really make much difference in terms of, what you don't have in Europe, which you get in the US, is kind of wall-to-wall advertising during an election campaign. We don't really have any of that, so it's not that significant in that way. But I think what the funding from people like Horowitz and Pamela Geller has also been a big supporter of Wilders, at least as a propagandist. What that shows is that's really a lot of his constituency. These are the people he cares about, that he's trying to reach and influence. And Wilders also, the French far right is quite anti-Semitic in its tradition. Wilders is not. He's very pro-Israel. He worked on a kibbutz when he was in his late teens. And he's always been, one of the kind of loudest voices for the Likud-style politics in Israel, promoting that in Europe. And so he wants to be part of that conversation in the world, and he has become so. So he's, in a way, he's heard almost as much in these American circles as he is in the Netherlands. What
about Russian influence, if any?
Yeah, Russia, you asked about that. the Dutch are very worried. I mean, it's hard for Russia to kind of spread fake news in Dutch because they don't have many people who speak Dutch. But and there doesn't seem to be much sign of that happening. But they're going to count all the ballots by hand on March 15th because they're afraid of Russia manipulating the voting booths. Because what Russia would like is for Wilders to win very big, to become by far the largest party, and then there would be a powerful anti-EU voice in the Netherlands as well. So there's a lot of anxiety, and the Russians have been hacking Dutch state institutions. The Dutch do know that. But you don't seem to have had the same influence on the election as you had in the U.S.
What kind of coalition might emerge after this election, assuming that Wilders obviously doesn't become prime minister, but does get 15, 16, 20% of the vote?
I mean, if he becomes the biggest party, then traditionally he will have the job of trying to form a coalition. So people will say, okay, Geert, give it a go. And then he's going to say, well, of course, in my government, we're going to ban Islam in the Netherlands, close the borders, and leave the European Union. And the other parties, which is his program, and the other parties say, well, we don't want to be in coalition with that. And so he will fail to form a coalition. He'll then blame the other parties, they'll blame him. And then the other parties will give it a go. Or if Wilders is not the largest party and the centre-right VVD, the VVV, is the largest party, the other parties then get their go. And they sit down together. There'll be months and months of coalition talks, and in the end there'll be a very big coalition, probably 4 or 5 parties, going from centre-right to centre-left, with maybe the Greens in there as well, and just some tiny parties in there to get to 50+% of the vote. And so it'd be a very complicated coalition. But the thing is, we have had that kind of thing in the Netherlands before. There's always big coalitions of several parties, and you have something similar in Germany. You have a centre-right, centre-left coalition in Germany between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, which the Dutch also have, centre-right and centre-left coalition now. So it would be, imagine if in the US, instead of the Republicans and the Democrats, you had 10 parties, and there was a Trump party, there was a Conservative party, there was a Hillary party, a Bernie party, each representing a very small slice of the political spectrum. That's what the Netherlands looks like.
To what extent will his policies have an influence regardless of what that coalition looks like?
I mean, he does kind of keep the heat on the parties. So they almost all are mean about Brussels. Almost all say immigrants must adapt or leave. Almost all are in favor of quite stringent restrictions on refugees coming in. So, to some degree, Wilders has already shaped the country. Without him, it would still be the much more liberal country that it was until 2001.
Where is and what candidates, what parties are really engaged in the strongest, most viable pushback to his ideas and his candidacy?
Well, there's a kind of liberal centrist party called the D66, and its leader, Alexander Pechtold, he just says, I'm going totally with liberalism because it's out of fashion, and so if you want to be a liberal, you have to come to me. So the D66 is totally pro-Europe. They like multiculturalism. They say that things are good in the Netherlands, which is, broadly true. The economy has been doing well. So that's the kind of party of unabashed liberalism. And then you have, GroenLinks, a Green Party, which says, we must do more for the environment, we must be nice to immigrants and poorer people. So you do have parties which are just saying, whatever Wilders does, we don't care. We're going to stick with our thing, and there is a constituency for us. Because in the States, you have to build a party that's big enough to get half the vote. In Holland, you don't have to do that. If you get 5 or 10% of the vote, you can still be a player in a coalition. So it's fine to be a niche party. In fact, there's even a party for the animals, which is also very different from Wilders, which is all about animal rights and vegetarianism, and they have a couple of percent of the vote as well. They could be in a coalition.
What is the economic state of the country at the moment? What is the state of unemployment and the economy in general?
Well, the 2008 crisis hit very hard, and there were years of austerity, and that was very painful, and there's now a care crisis in that older people can't get enough care. But things have got a lot better in recent years. The economy has been growing quite quickly by European standards, by Europe's slow economic growth standards. Unemployment's now down to 5%, so it's fallen quite sharply in the last year. things are pretty good. It's much more like Germany than like Greece. But as has been pointed out, as Cosmuda of the University of Georgia, who's a Dutch expert and a populist expert, points out, Dutch voters don't compare themselves to Greeks. They compare themselves to how Dutch voters were 10 years ago, and they still are feeling some of the pain of the financial crisis.
One of the things I think you pointed out is that not unlike the election in the U.S., that education is one of the biggest predictors of Wilders' support.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, his supporters tend to be people in small towns in the southeast and in the exurbs of big cities who have not been to university, white people who feel that they've been displaced and left behind. I mean, it looks a little bit like the U.S. white working class that voted Trump, but I have to say the Dutch white working class is in a much better situation. You don't have the fall in life expectancy you had in the U.S. You don't have the opioid epidemics. If you go to an American small town in a poorer area, you can hardly see evidence of the state. But in a Dutch small town, the state will be very present. There'll be a state library, there'll be state healthcare, there'll be state sports fields. So you don't have the same sense of it's just not as bad as in from what I've understood over the reporting of the last year, the situation to be in the American Rust Belt. There is nothing like the American Rust Belt in the Netherlands. And Holland had the big advantage that it was never really an industrial economy. It always stayed a service economy. There was very little manufacturing. And so you didn't have that massive post-industrial collapse that you had in the US or in Northern England.
When did the wave turn with respect to pushback to immigration? As I think you point out in one of your stories, immigration was taken for granted for so long there.
Yeah, I mean, when I was growing up, nobody really talks about it. It just wasn't a political issue. In the 60s, they'd gone to Turkey and Morocco and said, well, we need people to, sweep the floors and empty the bins, and the Turks and Moroccans sent people. And this was never really discussed by political parties, and nor was Europe. And so this all seemed to just be fine and go without any debate. And then, to me, the day it changed was 9/11, which was an enormous shock in the Netherlands. And there were TV pictures of what turned out to be a small group of teenagers, of Dutch Arab teenagers, singing that they were happy about the attacks of 9/11. And that shocked people. And there was this fear it would happen in Holland, and then Fortuyn was assassinated. So really from 9/11 through spring 2002, everything changed. Suddenly you started getting people saying immigration has been a disaster. We must send them back home. We must stop all this. The elites have betrayed us. And that was completely new because the Netherlands had been an immensely satisfied country. It had a sense that it was, leading progress in the world, that the elites had made all the right decisions. There was a pride in modernity. I mean, the Netherlands did gay marriage first. It legalized marijuana first. It had bike paths before anyone else. It really was the country of the future, even in the 80s. And so there was a great satisfaction and self-satisfaction. And that really shrank from 2001.
What does the press look like, and how has the press played these events?
I mean, the Dutch trust in the media is a lot higher than it is in the US. You have mostly state radio, you have a mix of state and private TV, and you have newspapers whose circulations are falling, of course, like everywhere else in the world, but are still pretty respectable and trusted. There are a couple of Breitbart-like sites which have done well. So there is a kind of voice for Wilders voters in the media as well, not in the main newspapers, but on these websites. But on the whole, Dutch people believe what they read in a way that Americans no longer seem to.
And finally, talk about the impact that you see this election having on the upcoming elections in France and Germany and Austria.
Well, I grew up in Holland. I went to school there. I speak Dutch. I still sometimes write articles in Dutch. So I have experienced this to a large degree from the Dutch point of view. And when I talk to foreigners about it, I realize that for most foreigners, the Dutch election is only about Wilders. He's the only character. So it's like a replay of Trump, and the only question is, will the bad guy win? And in Holland, it's not really like that. Wilders is a much smaller character. He's, people don't expect him to get into government. And so how will it play? I think what happens is Wilders, if he becomes the biggest party, but only fractionally, or if he doesn't become the biggest party, people are going to lose interest. Then you're going to months of coalition formation. It's going to be very boring. Nobody abroad is going to care. And the kind of Wilders spectre will have disappeared from the European scene. And then the question will be Le Pen. Because, I mean, there's 3 big elections in Europe this year. Germany and France, of course, bigger than Holland. Germany is not going to go populist. It's going to be between centre-right and centre-left. Holland is not going to go populist. But France might very well.
Simon Cooper, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening and joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.